In this video, we're going to formally introduce the prisoner's dilemma of exchange. If you recall from previous videos, the secondary goal of religion was for us to find meaning and purpose. Or another way of phrasing that was for us to overcome selfishness and evil in order to live a more efficient or more full life. Again, this happens because we're making exchanges or we're experiencing transcendence or ecstasy primarily in those interpersonal exchanges, either with another individual or with my past or future self, or as we get into religion, an exchange with the divine or the ideal self. This was modeled through the production possibility frontier, as I can go ahead and choose to produce fully within my own means, and here we have self-production, or I can specialize and trade from my comparative advantage to achieve a position or a quality of life or a state of being which is impossible for me to achieve on my own. And that's what we called transcendence. And again, those come from the root words of transcendence, which is to climb beyond. So here we're climbing beyond self. And also ecstasy, which is to stand outside. So we're standing outside of self. So we're going to go ahead and introduce and formalize this prisoner's dilemma of exchange. And we'll see here the role of religion in humanity and even the necessity of religion in humanity. Before we jump in, we're going to make this a little bit more concrete. So instead of focusing on interpersonal exchanges, we're going to go ahead and focus on material exchanges. Again, remember the role of metaphor is to help us understand something that's abstract by using concreteness. So even though we're going to be using physical resources here, go ahead and try to apply that to those interpersonal exchanges as we go. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's go ahead and have two individuals, person A and person B. Now these individuals can produce either food or shelter, or some combination of food and shelter. So currently we have them producing within their own means, not engaging in exchange, but just simply meeting their own needs through self-production. So they're both producing some combination of food and shelter that's going to allow them to achieve a certain state of being. But again, this is the state of being within their own ability to produce. Now let's focus on that matrix down here in the bottom right. So here we're going to go ahead and examine the different qualities of life given different orientations of production. So both these individuals are engaged in self-production, and they're achieving a quality of life that we will give the number 2, or the rank 2. So both these individuals are experiencing a quality of life that we're ranking 2. Now to read this, that first number is going to be for person A, and that second number will be for person B. Now again, these individuals could go ahead and specialize in their comparative advantage and trade from their comparative advantage. In this particular case, person A is going to be focused on food production and can specialize in food because they have a comparative advantage in food. And person B can focus on shelter production because they have a comparative advantage in shelter. As you can see here, the opportunity cost of producing a shelter is only 2 food for person B versus 6 food for person A. So person B is more efficient, or the low-cost producer of shelter, and therefore they should specialize in shelter and trade for food. Now again, that terms of trade could be anywhere between 2 food to 6 food. Both individuals would benefit if the terms of trade is equal to 1 shelter is equal to 4 food. And you can see here how person B benefits because it only costs them 2 food, where they can go ahead and trade that shelter for 4 food and become better off. In other words, they can achieve a position outside their production possibility frontier. The same is also true for person A. They could go ahead and buy a shelter from themselves for 6 food, or they can buy a shelter through exchange for only 4 food. And they also achieve a position which is a higher state of being than they would have achieved on their own. Again, this is represented in the matrix down here on the lower right, in which both individuals, person A and person B, increase their overall quality of life. So we could assume that both individuals would freely trade with each other. However, this equilibrium is not a stable equilibrium, and we'll see why. Let's go back to person A over here. And let's say person A says, you know what? If I only produce food, then I become vulnerable to the elements, and I could die if I don't have shelter. So therefore, maybe instead of me solely producing food, I should protect myself and produce a little bit of shelter. Now, person B is still going to specialize solely in shelter production. But now when they come together for terms of trade or to make an exchange, person A is at an advantage because person A has both shelter and food, where person B only has shelter. So if they can't reach any exchange, person A is still going to be somewhat better off or somewhat able to survive, whereas in person B would starve because they have zero food. So person A is at an advantage and can use that advantage to go ahead and extort terms of trade for person B. And this is a type of negotiating power. The negotiating power uses all three types of power. It's a resource, right? Economic power. We're also threatening, and therefore it is a psychological power, as well it is coercion or force in terms of a physical power, because if you don't trade, you will die. And so person A can go ahead and extort terms of trade or extort that and manipulate that terms of trade for their advantage. And here can even push that terms of trade where person B becomes worse off because of trade. Again, why would they do that? Well, they would do that because if they have no food at all, then they would die. So even though that they're going to not benefit from trade, and they're not going to achieve a position outside their possibility frontier, they've already committed to shelter production and therefore are going to need food and are willing to trade at a disadvantage to themselves. And so person A can actually become better off by agreeing to trade or agreeing to specialize, going back and not specializing, coming back and extorting the other individual. So here you can see that represented in the matrix down there at the bottom right as well. Person A increases their overall quality of life to 4 because they can even push themselves further outside the production possibility frontier. Whereas in person B is going to decrease their quality of life down all the way to 1 because they're not even producing at their production possibility frontier. But while this is true for person A, person B could do the same thing. Person B could go ahead and say they're going to produce shelter only, but produce a little bit of food. And when they come to the table, person A now is at a disadvantage because they're only producing food and therefore need shelter. Person B can use this same negotiating power or extortion techniques to manipulate that term of trade to their own advantage. And this is represented in the matrix down here at the lower right. So person B is better off by going ahead, agreeing to go ahead and produce shelter, changing that, and then extorting the other individual for their own advantage. So here, let's take a look solely at that matrix down there at the bottom right and see how this game is going to be solved in terms of what decisions should be made given the different agendas or the different paths that we have, the different payoffs that exist, and how we're going to solve this game for person A and person B. Well, let's take a look at person A. If person B produces only other-oriented, in other words, they're specializing in becoming vulnerable. Again, we saw here that it's in A's best interest to move down to self-production. So I should be self-oriented, self-centered, and therefore take advantage of person B to make myself even better off. Now, this is also true if person B is self-oriented. So if person B only produces self, well then I shouldn't become vulnerable. If person B is only producing self, I should also produce self. So here we have a dominant strategy for person A, which is self-production. Now the same is also true for person B. If person A is going to produce other-oriented or be other-focused, then they should produce self to take advantage. And the same thing is true if person A is self-oriented. Person B should also be self-oriented. And so you can see here that what's called the Nash equilibrium is going to be in which both players are solely going to be focused on themselves, solely self-centered, and not other-oriented, and therefore achieve a state of being which is possible for them to achieve, but is not a state of being which both individuals are going to increase their overall quality of life. And you can see how they're stuck. Person A is not going to want to switch to being other-oriented or to specializing and engaging in trade and becoming vulnerable because it makes them worse off if person B is going to be producing. Person B is not going to want to switch to being other-oriented if person A is self-oriented. So we're stuck down here in this prisoner's dilemma. So if we go back to the dyadic typology, we can see here that even if both individuals started off being other-oriented, that this is not a stable equilibrium. So if they're both engaged in acts of good and compassion, you can see how both individuals could become better off by engaging in selfishness, by moving to self-production in either way, either person A switching to self-production or person B switching to self-production. Again, the motivation could be I could become better off myself and you're harmed, that's an act of selfishness, or I could actually try to harm you and therefore have an act of evil. But you can see here, even if we're starting off with acts of good and compassion, this doesn't lead to a long-term equilibrium because both individuals can become better off to engage in acts of selfishness or an act of evil. And so we're not at a stable equilibrium here. And so the question here is, how do we overcome this prisoner's dilemma of exchange? Well, perhaps you might say, we could just use rational techniques. We don't need irrationality. We don't need the irrationality of religion. We can just use rational techniques to overcome this and make ourselves better off. But as you can see here, that the rational side of our typology, it's impossible for us, once we get down into these acts of selfishness and evil, it is impossible to move up that typology. So even though, right, economics is going to tell us that we should be engaged in acts of compassion and good, that this is not a stable equilibrium, and once we get down into that selfishness and evil, we actually cannot move up using rational techniques into acts of good and acts of compassion. It is not rational to do so, and therefore we need irrationality to move us into the upper half of that typology. To increase our overall quality of life, we need to engage in an irrational act. And so acts of good and acts of compassion are not possible once we move down into acts of selfishness and evil. Therefore, what we need is an irrational act to push us over up here into act of love or act of compassion to solve this prisoner's dilemma. And again, you can see here the purpose of religion. Because if I'm over here and I'm person B, and you can see down here in that matrix, if I'm person B, it is irrational for me to go from self to other, to be self-oriented and to be other-oriented, because I become worse off. I go from a state of being of 2 to a state of being of 1. But you become better off, or person A becomes better off if person B moves over into other-orientedness. So that's an act of love or an act of altruism that makes person B move over into other-orientedness. So we need an irrational act to move from self-production or self-centeredness into other-centeredness or other-orientedness. But not just one act of love or altruism. We need 2 acts. We need person A to also commit an act of love or altruism and move up. So both individuals need acts of love to move us out of that self-centered prisoner's dilemma and to be able to specialize, to become vulnerable, and to make exchanges. And so we need 2 acts of irrationality, 2 acts of love to push us out of that prisoner's dilemma. And so what we'll see here is that each of these religions are going to be able to use that religious power to push us over up here into that right-hand quadrant, to move us into acts of love and acts of altruism to get us to solve this prisoner's dilemma of exchange. And so we're going to go ahead and introduce the types of religions in the next video, and then start looking at these individuals and how they move us up into this irrational state and irrational acts of love and altruism.